There are wars that end with a treaty. There are wars that end with a silence. The Second World War ended with both things. For decades, Nazism was studied as a machine of destruction. What this documentary examines is something different, the blank spaces of that machine. The archives deliberately destroyed the last week of April of 1945, the scientists whose files were erased to make them usable by another government, the objects that were in one place and then were no longer there, the people who died or disappeared just when they were about to speak. 20 mysteries. Some have probable explanations that the available evidence does not allow to confirm. All of them happened. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. His assistant, Otto Günscher, later testified before the Soviets that very night Heinrich Müller was still in the bunker, supervising the last encrypted dispatches from the Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse. After that moment, no one ever saw him again. Müller had entered the Bavarian political police in 1919 as a specialist in surveillance of communist organizations. His career path was atypical among the Nazi elite. He was never a member of the NSDAP before 1933, a fact that generated distrust among the ideologues of the party. Himmler and Heydrich considered that detail irrelevant in light of his technical competence. He was admitted to the party in 1939, the same year in which he was appointed head of the Gestapo. Under his direction, the organization grew from approximately 7,000 agents in 1939 until controlling in 1944 a network of tens of thousands of regular agents and a much larger number of civilian informants spread throughout occupied Europe. Müller directly coordinated the operational logistics of the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, the meeting where 15 high officials of the Reich formalized the protocol for what they called the final solution. He also supervised the dismantling of the Soviet espionage network known as Rote Kapelle, or Red Orchestra, which operated within the Reich between 1939 and 1942. He personally directed the interrogations of the conspirators involved in the assassination attempt of July 20, 1944 against Hitler. In 1945, the operational knowledge of Müller about the Nazi security apparatus was probably the most extensive of any living person. In 1963, the authorities of West Berlin opened a grave in the Neuen Invalidenfriedhof cemetery that bore his name. Inside, they found remains of 3 distinct individuals, none of them identified as Müller by forensic analysis. The Simon Wiesenthal Center later requested DNA testing, a request that was denied for bureaucratic reasons that investigators qualified as unsatisfactory. The CIA files declassified between 1993 and 2001 under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act revealed that the agency continued gathering information on the possible whereabouts of Müller until well into the 70s. Several of these documents mention sources that placed Müller in Moscow, working for the MGB, predecessor of the KGB, in the years immediately following the war. This hypothesis has documentable historical coherence. During the period of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between 1939 and 1941, the Gestapo and the NKVD maintained operational communication channels to exchange information on communist and Trotskyist exiles in Western Europe, channels in which Müller participated directly. A man with his knowledge of the internal structure of the Third Reich would have had an extraordinary informational value for Moscow in 1945. However, no declassified Soviet archive has confirmed his presence in the USSR. Müller remains as the only high Nazi official whose fate has not been established with any degree of documentary certainty. On May 10, 1941, at 17:45 hours, Rudolf Hess took off alone from the Augsburg airfield at the controls of a Messerschmitt Bf 110D modified with additional fuel tanks. He flew 1,400 kilometers toward the north, crossed the Scottish coast at low altitude to avoid radar detection, and parachuted over Renfrewshire near the Eaglesham estate when the plane ran out of fuel. He was detained by a local farmer identified by the authorities as Rudolf Hess and delivered to British military custody. What turns this flight into one of the most debated mysteries of the war is not the fact itself, but the question of why he did it and what exactly happened afterward. Hess was in May 1941 the third most powerful man of the Reich in terms of protocol. Deputy of the Führer, responsible for coordinating the Nazi Party, present at the signing of the Munich Agreement in 1938 and directly involved in the drafting of the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. His decision to act unilaterally is incompatible with the hierarchical structure of the regime. In Nazi Germany, no official of that rank undertook a diplomatic mission not sanctioned by Hitler. And yet, Hess did it. There is a detail that popular accounts usually overlook. Hess was not an occasional pilot who rented a plane. He was an aviator with real experience. He had participated in the First World War as a pilot and knew the Messerschmitts well. The Bf-110D that he piloted that day had been modified specifically for long-distance flights with additional fuel tanks installed under the wings. That modification required time, technical resources, and the collaboration of maintenance personnel. The flight was prepared weeks in advance. The official British version, maintained for decades and backed by the classification of the relevant files, held that Hess acted on his own initiative, driven by an increasingly unstable personality and by the personal belief that he could negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain. According to this version, he was received by low-ranking officials, subjected to several interrogations in which he turned out to be incoherent and confined as a prisoner of war with his proposals without being taken seriously. Hitler, upon learning the news, officially declared him insane. The problem with this version is that several documentary elements do not fit. Hess flew directly to the lands of the Duke of Hamilton, with whom he had maintained prior correspondence through a Swedish intermediary, Professor Karl Haushofer. Hamilton was a Scottish aristocrat with connections in British appeasement circles, the political group that had pressed for a negotiated agreement with Germany until 1939. The fact that Hess knew the exact location of the Hamilton estate and could fly there without being effectively intercepted raises questions about the level of advance warning that the British intelligence services might have had. An unidentified plane that crosses the Scottish coast at low altitude is not invisible to the British air defence system of 1941. It was detected. The decision not to intercept it before Hess parachuted has not been explained in a satisfactory manner in any declassified document. The historical researcher John Harris, in a work published in 2011 based on partially declassified files, maintains that the flight of Hess was the result of a decoy operation by MI6, which would have fed Hess the illusion that there existed in Great Britain a group willing to negotiate. The objective would have been to extract information about German intentions regarding Operation Barbarossa, which would be launched barely 6 weeks later on June 22, 1941. If that hypothesis is correct, Hess was not an unstable fanatic acting alone. He was a man who genuinely believed he had interlocutors on the Allied side and who was manipulated to reveal what he knew. The exact nature of the proposals that Hess carried with him was never publicly revealed. The minutes of his interrogations with General Duke of Hamilton, with Yvonne Kirkpatrick of the Foreign Office, and with other British officials remained classified for decades. What leaked through indirect references in other documents suggests that Hess proposed a negotiated peace in which Germany would maintain its control over continental Europe in exchange for not attacking the British Empire. If that was all he offered, the explanation of the delusional fanatic turns out to be more plausible. But the classification of the files for 76 years, when the standard norm in the United Kingdom is 30 years, suggests that there was something else that the government considered too sensitive to reveal. The complete files of the Hess case in the National Archives of the United Kingdom were classified until 2017. When they were partially declassified, the result was disappointing for researchers who expected definitive answers. Many documents had been redacted or were incomplete. Some simply were not there. Hess was tried in Nuremberg, sentenced to life imprisonment and confined in the Spandau prison in Berlin, where he was the only prisoner during the last 20 years of his detention. The requests for clemency on the part of his family and of his lawyers were systematically blocked by the Soviet Union, which exercised the rotating veto among the four powers that administered Spandau. Why the USSR had so much interest in keeping Hess imprisoned when it allowed the release of war criminals of comparable category is a question that the available Soviet files do not answer. Hess died on August 17, 1987, at 93 years old. His family always maintained that it was a homicide, arguing that a man of his age with severe arthritis and very reduced mobility could not have hanged himself with an electrical cord in the position and height in which he was found. The official autopsy ruled suicide. The cord used was that of a lamp from a small cabin in the prison garden where Hess used to rest. His son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, hired an independent forensic doctor, Dr. W. Hugh Thomas, who published his conclusions indicating that the marks on the neck were inconsistent with a self-inflicted hanging. The controversy was never resolved. The question of what specific proposals Hess carried on that flight, if any high British official found out directly about them, and why both the United Kingdom and the USSR had so much interest in keeping the case opaque, remains without a complete documentary answer. On November 27, 1944, the crew of a bomber of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron presented the first official report before the headquarters of the 15th Air Force. They were on a mission over the Rhine Valley. The report described two spheres of reddish-orange light that flew in formation next to the bomber during approximately 30 minutes, maintaining a constant distance of 50 to 100 meters before separating and disappearing. The squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herm Bromemer, forwarded the report to headquarters because the description did not match any known aircraft, flares, or weapons. In the following weeks, similar reports arrived from crews of B-17 and B-24 bombers over Germany, Austria, and the Balkans, and from pilots of P-38 and P-51 fighters on escort missions. The pilots called them Foo Fighters, a term taken from the comic strip Smokey Stover, but the reports were entirely official and were treated as such. The initial working hypothesis of the Allied command was that the objects constituted a remote-controlled weapon designed to interfere with the ignition systems of the engines or the navigation instruments. It was a reasonable hypothesis. The Luftwaffe had developed the Henschel H's 293 anti-ship missile and the Fritz X glide bomb, and there existed documentation about more experimental projects in the research centers of Peenemünde and Rechlin. The problem was that the Foo Fighters did not interfere with any system in any of the documented cases. No aircraft reported electrical failures, loss of navigation, or radio interference during the sightings, and there was never any attempt of attack. Following the German capitulation, teams from Operation Lusty interrogated engineers and pilots of the Luftwaffe without finding any reference to a program of luminous, remote-controlled objects. The German scientists interrogated confirmed furthermore that their own pilots had reported exactly about the same phenomena since the end of 1943, and that the Luftwaffe had attributed them to Allied experimental weapons. This symmetry in the reports was in itself the strongest argument against any explanation of human origin. If both sides observed the same objects without being able to identify them and attributed them to the enemy, the most parsimonious explanation was that they did not belong to either of the two. The projects Sign and Grudge of the United States Air Force, initiated in 1947 and 1948 as part of the first systematic studies of unidentified aerial phenomena, reviewed the reports and did not arrive at any conclusion. The phenomenon of St. Elmo's fire, a luminous electrostatic discharge documented on metallic structures under specific atmospheric conditions, could explain some sightings, but not those in which the objects exhibited active and sustained behavior independent of the observing aircraft. The Foo Fighters remain, in strict documentary terms, as a verified phenomenon without an established explanation. On May 2, 1945, the U-97-7, under the command of Oberleutnant Heinz Schaffer, set sail from Kiel. When he received the capitulation order, Schaffer gathered his crew and offered the men with families in Germany the possibility of being disembarked in Norway. 16 crew members chose to disembark on the Norwegian coast of Holsenoy on May 10. The 33 remaining continued with Schaffer on a submerged voyage that lasted 66 consecutive days without contact with the surface, crossing the Atlantic and arriving at Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945. It was the longest continuous immersion period ever recorded at that time for a conventional submarine, achieved thanks to the snorkel system that allowed the batteries to be recharged without emerging completely. The interrogations conducted by the United States Navy for weeks in Buenos Aires specifically sought evidence that the U-97-7 had transported high-profile passengers, possibly including Hitler, whose body had not been conclusively identified in a forensic manner at that time. Schaffer denied it, and the investigation found no evidence of undeclared passengers. However, the case of the U-97-7 demonstrated something with implications that go beyond its own trip. In the summer of 1945, with all the Allied anti-submarine surveillance deployed in the Atlantic, a U-boot could cross the ocean without being detected. The U-530, which had arrived at Mar del Plata on July 10, 1945, 5 weeks before the U-97-7, with a reduced crew compared to its full complement and without a satisfactory explanation for several months of undocumented activity, was never investigated with the same rigor as the U-97-7. The Argentine intelligence files of the period 1945 to 1950 remain largely inaccessible to external researchers. What the history of the U-97-7 cannot answer is a broader question. Among the approximately 40 U-booty that were in the Atlantic at the moment of the capitulation and simply stopped responding to radio transmissions, how many crossed the ocean, where they went, and what or whom they were transporting? That is a question that the available files do not allow to answer. The Amber Room was conceived in 1701 by the sculptor Andreas Schluter at the request of King Frederick I of Prussia. Its construction lasted more than a decade, with the participation of the Danish master craftsman Gottfried Wolfram, and consumed approximately 6 tons of Baltic amber carved into more than 100,000 individual pieces assembled in gilded frames and mirrors. In 1716, Frederick William I ceded it to Tsar Peter the Great as a diplomatic gesture during the negotiations for the Northern Alliance against Sweden. Prussian craftsmen took another 10 years to install it definitively in the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg, where it remained for more than 2 centuries. When the forces of Army Group North captured Tsarskoye Selo on September 17, 1941, the Soviet conservators had already tried to evacuate the room. The amber, after more than 200 years exposed to variations in temperature and humidity, was extremely fragile. Several panels had cracked during the first attempts at disassembly, and the conservators had chosen to cover them with wallpaper and gauze as an emergency measure. The soldiers of the 58th German Infantry Division identified them despite the camouflage and alerted the specialists of the Kunstschutz, the art protection service of the German army. In less than 40 hours, the panels were disassembled and packed in 27 boxes. They arrived in Königsberg on October 13, 1941, and were installed in the castle of the city under the supervision of Alfred Rode, director of the Municipal Museum, where they were publicly exhibited until 1944. The RAF bombing of Königsberg on August 26 and 27, 1944 destroyed approximately 80% of the historical center of the city. Rode reported in October that the panels had survived in the basement of the castle, but his communications with the Reich Ministry of Culture became increasingly evasive regarding their exact condition. The Gauleiter of East Prussia, Erich Koch, whose regional authority repeatedly blocked evacuation attempts, was arrested by Polish authorities in 1949 and sentenced to death in 1959, although the sentence was commuted. Koch always denied knowing where the panels were. When the Soviets took Königsberg on April 9, 1945, after 4 days of urban combat, the researchers of the Trophy Motel, the Red Army unit in charge of recovering works of art, searched the basement of the castle and found only minor fragments. Rode died of typhus in December 1945. His colleague Paul Feyerabend died under unexplained circumstances shortly after. In 1997, a mosaic of semi-precious stones that was part of the collection was recovered in Germany, obtained from the heirs of a former German soldier, confirming that at least part of the material had left Königsberg before or during the final battles. The Polish historian Izabela Galika, after decades of research, concluded that the main panels were probably destroyed in the castle fires of 1944, and that the subsequent statements of Rovda about their survival were a strategy to avoid reprisals. The complete reconstruction inaugurated in 2003 in Tsarskoye Selo, jointly financed by Russia and Germany with an investment of $11 million and 24 years of work, did not resolve the historical question. The originals, if they survived, have not appeared. In October 1940, while Adolf Hitler and the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco met in Hendaya to discuss the possible entry of Spain into the war, Heinrich Himmler was heading to the Abbey of Montserrat in Catalonia with a different mission. He was looking for the Holy Grail. The Ahnenerbe, formally founded on July 1, 1935 by Himmler, was an SS institution dedicated to the research and teaching of the ancestral Aryan heritage. In the book by historian Eric Frattini about this organization, it is documented how the Ahnenerbe came to have more than 50 departments and branches that covered archaeology, folklore, linguistics, natural sciences, and, in a significant way, the search for relics of supposed supernatural power. The belief that certain ancestral objects could confer military or political power to whoever possessed them was not marginal within Nazism. It was a concern that reached Himmler directly and, in a more tangential way, Hitler himself. The German medievalist Otto Rahn was hired by the SS in the 30s to search for the Grail in the south of France, among the ruins of Cathar castles. Rahn published 2 books documenting his expeditions and rose within the organization until reaching the rank of Untersturmführer. His conviction was that the medieval poem Parzival by Wolfram von Eschenbach contained keys to the actual location of the sacred chalice, and that this location pointed to Montségur, a Cathar fortress in the Pyrenees. Rahn was assigned to guard duties at the Dachau concentration camp in 1937 as a sanction, and in 1939 his body was found frozen in the Austrian Alps. The cause of death was registered as exposure. There are those who suggest suicide. The investigation was never conclusive. When Himmler showed up at the Abbey of Montserrat, the only monk who spoke German, Andreu Ripoll, tried to convince him that the monastery did not possess any special chalice and that the oldest relic they preserved was the Moreneta, an image of the Virgin dated to the year 880. Himmler withdrew without what he was looking for. According to the historian Jesus Hernandez Martinez, upon being informed that the Grail was not there, the Reichsführer SS exclaimed that all of Germany knew it was in Montserrat. The conviction of Himmler had its origin in part in the book by Rahn titled Lucifer's Court, published in 1937, where he established that connection. And it must be remembered that the opera Parsifal by Richard Wagner, favorite composer of Hitler, located the Castle of the Grail in a setting deliberately associated with that territory. The Ahnenerbe did not find the Holy Grail. What it did find systematically was the pseudo-scientific justification that the regime needed for its racial theses, using expeditions to Finland, Tibet, Bolivia, and Spain as settings for a research designed to confirm predetermined conclusions. On January 12, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Vistula Oder from the Soviet bridgeheads on the Vistula River with an unprecedented concentration of forces on the Eastern Front. 163 divisions, more than 32,000 pieces of artillery, and 6,500 tanks. In 18 days, the Red Army advanced 500 kilometers and established positions less than 80 kilometers from Berlin. This offensive turned Silesia, the region that represented 25% of the industrial production of the Reich, in 1944, according to records of the Ministry of Armaments of Albert Speer, into territory about to be lost irreversibly. It was in that precise period, from mid-January to the first days of February 1945, when the Nazi evacuation machinery operated at full capacity in the Sudeten Mountains. Under those mountains there exists a system of underground structures whose construction began in 1943 under the code name of Project Riese, Giant in German. The TOT organization supervised the construction using labor from the subcamps of the Gross-Rosen complex. The partially preserved records of the main camp indicate that between 1943 and 1945, there worked simultaneously between 13,000 and 15,000 prisoners on the different excavation fronts, with a total rotation estimated at more than 30,000 people. The mortality rates were extremely high. The system includes at least 7 distinct underground complexes within a radius of 30 kilometers around the city of Wolbezich, with an excavated area that Polish engineers estimated in the 60s at more than 9 kilometers of galleries. Its official purpose was never established in any surviving document. The records of the TOT organization relative to Silesia disappeared before the end of the war, possibly destroyed by the SS in the last days of January 1945. What does exist is a notarial document signed in Wroclaw in 1946 by Tony Stratling and Rudolf Buchmann, 2 former employees of the Regional Mining Administration. They testified before a notary that they had participated in the loading and sealing of a railway convoy inside the tunnels of the Riese system in the last days of January 1945, when the Soviet advance made the fall of Breslau imminent. According to their testimony, the train transported gold ingots from the Reichsbank, confiscated art from occupied territories, and highly classified strategic documents. They described the sealing of the entrance with explosives and the subsequent destruction of the records of the operation. For decades, this was the only concrete element on which the legend rested. In September 2015, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter presented before the authorities of Wolbezich images that, according to them, showed the silhouette of an armored vehicle on rails at a depth of about millimeters. The Polish government mobilized teams from the National Geological Institute. The excavations carried out between 2016 and 2017 did not find any metallic structure. The geologists determined that the anomalies corresponded to air pockets and changes in the density of the soil. However, that negative result at a specific point does not close the question about the complete system. The Soviet files of the NKVD, partially declassified after 1991, include reports documenting searches for underground deposits in the Silesia region between 1945 and 1947, searches that also failed to produce recorded results. The fact that the Soviets themselves dedicated resources to this investigation for 2 years indicates that the possibility was considered serious enough to act. A cold morning of January of 1939, 5 unusual men entered the ancient city of Lhasa, Tibet. Young, fair-skinned, dressed in Western clothing that contrasted with the surroundings, they were the emissaries of Heinrich Himmler. Ernst Schaefer, zoologist and explorer, led the expedition. His connection with the Nazis had begun years before, when his passion for exploration found an unexpected patron in Himmler. Although Schaefer had scarce interest in Nazi ideology, his desire for scientific funding led him to collaborate with the SS. The expedition was officially denominated as a scientific and anthropological exploration, and it was, in part, the team documented the flora, fauna, and populations of the region with genuine technical rigor. Underneath that academic facade rested other objectives. Some Nazi theorists believed that Tibet could hold keys to the origins of the Aryan race. The team of Schaefer received instructions to gather anthropological data, including physical measurements and facial molds of the Tibetan population, with the hope of finding evidence that supported those theories. There was also a geopolitical dimension. The Nazis recognized the strategic location of Tibet in Asia and saw possibilities of establishing links with the region, eventually to use it as a base for anti-British operations. The team returned to Germany in 1939 with thousands of biological specimens, hundreds of anthropological measurements, and very extensive photographic documentation. Schaefer presented his findings to Himmler, who was so impressed that he projected a new mission to return to Tibet and organize a pro-German army destined to challenge British power in India. The Second World War prevented that plan from materializing. What remains unclarified is the hidden dimension of the messages that the expedition exchanged. In the archives recovered by the Allies, there exist communications whose content was never fully disclosed. The presence of an SS expedition in territory that Great Britain considered its sphere of influence in the exact period prior to the war generated intelligence reports that remain partially classified. Schaefer was rewarded with his own department within the Ahnenerbe. After the war, he was detained, interrogated, and eventually released. He was never tried. He continued publishing about his Tibetan experiences until his death in 1992. But the most compromising parts of his relationship with the organization of Himmler remain in documents to which the general public does not have complete access. In 1912, Adolf Hitler was a failed painter of 23 years old who lived in Vienna and who did not manage to pass the admission exam of the Academy of Fine Arts. One day, surprised by a storm, he took refuge in the Hofburg Palace Museum. There, in the Imperial Treasury Room, he encountered for the first time the Spear of Longinus, also known as the Spear of Destiny, an iron point of about 50 centimeters long with a split blade and a repair with silver wire. In the center could be appreciated the head of a nail and a gold band with the Latin inscription Lancea et clavus Domini, the spear and the nail of the Lord. The legend associated with this relic held that it belonged to the Roman legionary Longinus, who pierced with it the side of Christ during the crucifixion. Tradition affirmed that Charlemagne had triumphed in more than 47 battles thanks to having it in his possession, and that he died shortly after it fell from him accidentally. The Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa suffered the same fate. He died drowned in a river in Turkey on the way to the Holy Land after the spear slipped from his hands. On March 14, 1938, following the annexation of Austria, Hitler entered victorioso into Vienna. According to the historian Jesus Hernandez Martinez in his work on the Second World War, Hitler, accompanied by Himmler, headed to the museum and remained alone for more than 1 hour before that relic. 5 months later, in August of the same year, the spear and other 31 pieces of the Austrian treasure left on a train escorted by the SS toward Nuremberg. The object was kept in an air raid shelter excavated under the Kaiserberg Castle. In March of 1945, the mayor of Nuremberg, Willy Liebel, fearful that the shelter would not offer sufficient protection, ordered that it be hidden in a chamber of the Panierplatz bunker and that the entrance to that chamber be sealed. 1 month later, Liebel died in combat. Nuremberg fell shortly after. The spear was found on August 7, 1945, 3 months after the suicide of Hitler. Those who maintain that Hitler committed suicide exactly when the Allies seized the spear must confront the chronological problem. Hitler died on April 30 and the spear was found on August 7. In 2003, the metallurgist and writer Robert Feather obtained permits to examine the spear under laboratory conditions, carefully removing the gold and silver bands that held it together. His analysis, backed by other experts, estimated that the blade dates from the 7th century after Christ, which makes it impossible that it was the weapon that wounded Christ in the 1st century. The spear is currently exhibited in the Hofburg Imperial Palace of Vienna, considered as part of the Art History Museum. The relic that Hitler believed would guarantee him victory remains in the same place where he found it. In April of 1945, units of the Third Army of Patton discovered in the Kaiser banknotes, coins from 27 countries, and a number of personal gold objects that analysts from the Allied Ministry of Finance unequivocally identified as coming from the extermination camps. This finding was personally inspected by Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton on April 12, 1945. However, that deposit represented only a fraction of the total. The Ministry of Finance of the Reich had begun to disperse. However, the amounts of gold suggested by contemporary testimonies never appeared. The most persistent financial aspect of the Nazi legacy was the Swiss connection. The Eisenstadt Report, published in 1997 by the United States Department of State, documented that between 1939 and 1945 Switzerland acquired gold from the Reichsbank for a value of between $400 and $600 million. Of the restitution of that gold were not concluded until the agreement of August of 1998, in which Swiss banks paid $1,250 million to a compensation fund for victims of the Holocaust. The complete fate of the assets of the Third Reich, including those transferred through diplomatic channels to Spain, Portugal, Argentina, fair operations ever conceived. Its base was not bombs, naval blockades, nor industrial sabotage, but something much more fragile: trust in money. Operation Bernhard was a systematic attempt to destroy the British economy through the mass counterfeiting of its currency. The plan was initiated in 1942 under the direction of the Hauptsturmführer of the SS Bernhard Krüger. The objective was simple in its formulation, but extraordinarily complex in its execution: to flood the British financial system with counterfeited British pounds indistinguishable from the authentic ones. To carry it out, the SS created a secret printing press inside the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. There, about 140 prisoners were selected, not for their ideology, but for their skills. There were professional printers, engravers, chemists, typographers, and experienced counterfeiters. These men were separated from the rest of the prisoners and forced to work under the direct threat of execution if they failed. The technical challenge was extraordinary. British banknotes used linen paper with complex watermarks, specific inks, and serial numbering with logical patterns. Each element had to be replicated to perfection. The prisoners analyzed authentic banknotes with microscopes, identified the chemical composition of the inks, and developed methods to imitate the watermarks, creating variations in the density of the paper during its manufacture. The greatest challenge was the serial numbers. It was not enough that they were unique, but they had to follow credible sequences that would not raise suspicions in banks or businesses. By means of statistical intelligence, they managed to reproduce plausible patterns. For 1943, the banknotes produced surpassed all known inspections. British experts who examined them after the war recognized that they were virtually indistinguishable from the originals. Germany produced around £132 million in counterfeited currency, an enormous sum for the time. However, the original plan of flooding the British economy directly was never completely executed. The fake banknotes were used as a covert tool to pay agents in neutral countries, finance intelligence operations, and acquire strategic materials in international markets. The counterfeit currency allowed Germany to operate abroad without spending real reserves, becoming a silent but effective instrument. When defeat became inevitable, the SS tried to erase the evidence. Boxes full of banknotes were thrown into alpine lakes, along with the printing plates and the documents. Lake Toplitz would end up being the deposit of a significant part of that material. Some of the prisoners were evacuated with the intention of eliminating them, but several survived and testified after the war. Thanks to them, the operation could be reconstructed in detail. Operation Bernhard did not destroy the British economy, but it proved that money, as a system based on trust, can be attacked in a systematic way. The Bank of England discreetly withdrew certain issues and accepted that the damage was irreversible. In May of 1945, before the war in Europe officially ended, United States intelligence officers were already operating in German territory with precise lists of names. They were looking for scientists. The same ones who had designed the V-2 rocket, experimented with chemical and biological weapons, and supervised weapon production in slave labor factories. The Operation Paperclip, as researcher Annie Jacobsen documents, was a United States intelligence program that brought German scientists to America under secret military contracts. It began formally in May of 1945 and eventually incorporated more than 1,600 technologists of Hitler into United States military and scientific institutions. The program was governed by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, created exclusively to recruit and employ Nazi scientists in armament projects. Of the 21 most prominent men that Jacobsen documents, 8 had worked alongside Hitler, Himmler, or Goering at some point during the war. 15 were committed members of the Nazi Party. 10 had belonged to paramilitary units of the SS or the SA. 1 was convicted of mass murder and slavery, served part of his sentence, received clemency, and was hired by the United States Department of Energy. Werner von Braun, technical director of the V-2 program, had regularly visited the Mittelwerk facilities in the Kohnstein Mountain, where the rockets were produced by concentration camp prisoners under conditions designed for extreme attrition. He knew what was happening there. He was taken to the United States, obtained American citizenship, and directed the development of the rocket that sent humans to the moon. For this to be possible, the files of many of these scientists during the war were systematically expurgated by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. The Nazi Party records, the connections with the SS, the reports on medical experiments on prisoners, the participation in armament programs with slave labor, everything was eliminated or reclassified to facilitate their integration into the United States scientific program. This systematic expurgation is in itself a perpetuated form of secrecy. What we know about the real scope of the war activities of these scientists depends partially on the records that survived by accident, on the testimonies of survivors who found ears willing to listen, and on the subsequent declassifications that revealed what the official version had suppressed. Arthur Rudolph, another key engineer of Mittelwerk, left the United States in 1984 after investigations were initiated into his role in Dora. He was never formally tried. In the early morning of February 25, 1942, barely 79 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and 1 day after a Japanese submarine bombarded Elwood, California, the air raid sirens began to sound over Los Angeles. At 3:16 in the morning, the 37th Coastal Artillery Brigade took the decision to begin firing .50 caliber machine guns and 12.8-pound anti-aircraft shells against an unidentified object in the sky. The fire continued until 4:14 in the morning. The shells damaged buildings and vehicles. 5 people lost their lives, 2 from stress-induced heart attacks and 3 in traffic accidents during the blackout. The Secretary of the Navy attributed the incident to what he called war nerves. General George C. Marshall suggested that commercial planes could have been used as a psychological warfare tactic. No enemy aircraft was shot down. No identifiable aircraft fragment was recovered. The alerted pilots never took off. The press was kept in ignorance about the real nature of the object. The congressman from Santa Monica Leland Ford demanded a full congressional investigation, declaring that none of the explanations offered removed the episode from the category of complete mystery. His demands were ignored. What connects the Battle of Los Angeles with the European Foo Fighters is the symmetry of the perplexity. In both cases, luminous or unidentified objects were observed by trained military observers, registered in official reports, and attributed to the enemy without evidence that that enemy had produced them. In both cases, the subsequent investigation did not produce a satisfactory explanation. Lloyd's of London, which insures vessels in that area at the same price as the rest of the Atlantic, has never considered that any zone of the Californian Pacific represents a statistically superior risk. But the objects that provoked the military response of February 25, 1942, were never identified. Between 1923 and 1937, excavations in the Jokudian Cave, 45 kilometers southwest of Peking, directed successively by the Canadian paleontologist Davidson Black and the German Franz Weidenreich, unearthed remains of 45 to 50 distinct individuals, 14 partial or complete skulls, 12 jaws, 147 isolated teeth, and several postcranial bones. It was the most complete sample of Homo erectus known in the world, and the primary material on which the scientific understanding of that stage of human evolution rested. Weidenreich, who had left Germany in 1934 due to racial exclusion laws, made plaster molds of all the specimens between 1937 and 1941, today preserved in the American Museum of Natural History of New York. Without those molds, the scientific loss would have been total and irreversible. When the Imperial Japanese Army occupied the Peking area in July of 1937, the safety of the fossils became an operational concern for the Peking Union Medical College, administered by the Rockefeller Foundation. The director, Dr. Henry H. Houghton, negotiated for 4 years with the United States Department of State to find a solution. In November of 1941, with the deterioration of relations between Washington and Tokyo, the decision was made to send the fossils to the United States aboard the SS President Harrison from the port of Qinhuangdao. The boxes were delivered to Colonel William Ashurst, commander of the Marine Detachment in Peking, on December 5, 1941. On December 8, Japan declared war on the United States. The Japanese troops captured the Marines in Qinhuangdao before they could embark. The boxes had disappeared. Colonel Ashurst, interrogated during his captivity and again after the war, declared that the boxes had been loaded onto a train destined for the port, but that he could confirm if they ever came to be embarked. The SS President Harrison was captured by the Japanese on December 8 off the Chinese coast and converted into a transport ship, without any trace of the fossils being found on board. In 1972, the United States businessman Christopher Janus publicly offered a reward of $150,000 for information on their whereabouts, which led to several false leads, including an extortion attempt with a supposedly original skull that turned out to be a copy. The Chinese government investigations carried out in 2012 and 2016 in the area of the former Marine barracks in Qinhuangdao found nothing. The original fossils, if they survived the chaos of December 1941, remain unfound after more than 80 years of intermittent search. On December 5, 1945, 5 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron Lifestyle 19 took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida at 14:10. It was a routine navigation and bombing exercise. It had 14 crew members. Lieutenant Charles Taylor in command had 259 recorded flight hours, but very little specific experience in the Western Atlantic area where the exercise would develop. At 15:40, the controller at Fort Lauderdale received the first alarm. Taylor contacted the base to report that both of his compasses had failed and that he did not recognize his position. He said he believed he was over the Florida Keys, south of the peninsula, when the subsequent reconstruction of his flight path indicates that he was actually east of the Bahamas in the open Atlantic. Basing himself on this incorrect assumption, Taylor ordered the formation to fly north, believing that that would take them over land. This decision led the 5 planes toward the north and the east, toward the open ocean. At 1750, with the sun low and turbulence increasing, the messages from Taylor indicated that fuel was running out. The last contact was at 1904. The 5 Avengers fell into the sea between 1930 and 2000 when their tanks became empty. The Martin PBM Mariner sent to look for them at 1927 disappeared 13 minutes after takeoff without sending any distress signal. A merchant ship in the area reported having seen an explosion in the air at approximately that time and location. The PBM Mariner was known among pilots as the flying gas tank due to its tendency to accumulate fuel vapors in the fuselage, and the hypothesis most accepted by naval investigators was an internal explosion. The Naval Board of Review of 1946 determined that the cause of the disappearance of Flight 19 was the disorientation of Taylor, but added that the weather conditions at dusk were severe enough to have prevented any effective emergency ditching, which explained the absence of floating debris. When Charles Berlitz wrote his bestseller of 1974 about the Bermuda Triangle, using Flight 19 as a central case, he omitted the conclusions of the naval report and eliminated from the account the documented bad weather conditions. Lloyd's of London insures those waters at the same price as the rest of the Atlantic and has never considered that the zone represents a statistically superior risk. But the fate of the rescue mariner, which disappeared without a trace in 13 minutes, keeps part of the file open. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish architect and businessman of 32 years old, with no prior diplomatic experience when he was recruited in June of 1944 by the War Refugee Board of the United States, an organization created by Roosevelt in January of that year to try to stop the extermination of the European Jews. Wallenberg arrived in Budapest on July 9, 1944 as first secretary of the Swedish legation, 2 months after German forces occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944, and began deporting Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz at a rate of between 12,000 and 15,000 people daily, the most accelerated phase of extermination in the entire history of the Holocaust. In the following 6 months, Wallenberg developed a protection system that combined the mass issuance of Swedish protective passports, the Schutzpasse, with direct negotiation with SS officials and with Adolf Eichmann, who personally directed the deportations from Budapest. The Schutzpasse had no formal legal validity under international law, but Wallenberg designed them with the visual appearance of official Swedish documents and backed them with diplomatic pressure that in practice led the German and Hungarian authorities to recognize them. He issued between 15,000 and 20,000 of these documents. Furthermore, he organized safe houses under the Swedish flag in Budapest, where he housed thousands of Hungarian Jews. Historians estimate that his actions contributed to saving between 50,000 and 100,000 lives, although the exact figures are the subject of academic debate. On January 17, 1945, when the Soviet forces had already surrounded Budapest and the combats were advancing toward the center of the city, Wallenberg met with Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, commander of the Second Ukrainian Front, to try to secure Soviet protection for the remaining Jews in the city. He was detained by the Soviets immediately after that meeting. The official reason for his detention was never explained in a satisfactory manner. The Soviet government initially informed Sweden that Wallenberg was under its protection. In 1957, the Soviet Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Gromyko, formally notified the Swedish government that Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in the Lubyanka prison on July 17, 1947. No document was ever provided to back this version. In the following decades, several former Soviet prisoners released after the death of Stalin in 1953 affirmed having had contact with Wallenberg in various Soviet gulags on dates subsequent to 1947. In 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russian government delivered to the Swedish government a set of documents related to the case, but the main KGB archives on Wallenberg were not fully declassified. The hypothesis that Wallenberg was detained because the Soviets considered him an agent of the United States intelligence services, given his connection with the War Refugee Board funded by Washington, has contextual coherence that several researchers have pointed out, but no available archive has definitively confirmed it. In November of 1944, the Dutch-American physicist Samuel Goudsmit, scientific director of Operation Alsos, a secret program attached to the Manhattan Project destined to evaluate German scientific progress, was in an apartment in Strasbourg reading documents by candlelight. The apartment belonged to the German virologist Eugen Hagen, who had abandoned the city days before with the German retreat. On that night, in an envelope of apparently routine scientific correspondence, Goudsmit and his colleague Fred Wardenberg uttered a cry at the same time. They had found a letter that Hagen wrote to his colleague August Hirt in 1943. Of the 100 prisoners you sent me, 18 died in the transport. Only 12 are in proper condition for my experiments. Therefore, I request that you send me another 100 prisoners between 20 and 40 years old, healthy and in physical condition comparable to that of soldiers. Hagen was a virologist who in 1932 had received a prestigious fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, where he had contributed to the development of the first vaccine against yellow fever. In 1937, he had been a candidate for the Nobel Prize. Now he tested vaccines on concentration camp prisoners supplied by Himmler's SS. The logic was sinister but coherent. To deploy a biological weapon against an enemy force, the attacking army needed to have previously developed its own vaccine against the deadly pathogen it intended to release. This vaccine would act as the shield for its own soldiers. The biological weapon would act as the sword. What the archives of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biochemistry contained about experiments with biological agents was in part destroyed before the end of the war. The Nuremberg trials, as Jacobson documents in her investigation on Operation Paperclip, prosecuted a part of those responsible but left out others whose files had been expurgated to facilitate their incorporation into United States or Soviet scientific programs. Kurt Blom, Deputy Medical Director of the Reich and responsible for German biological weapons programs, was tried in Nuremberg and acquitted. Subsequently, he was hired by the United States Army to work in medical research. Walter Schreiber, Medical General of the Reich and responsible for vaccine programs, the defensive counterpart of biological weapons, was taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip and eventually expelled when the press revealed his past. The complete extension of the Nazi biological weapons program was never publicly established because the archives of the Military Scientific Medical Institute that backed it were systematically destroyed in the final weeks of the war. The strategic dependence of the Reich on Arctic meteorological data was a direct consequence of the geography of the North Atlantic. The low-pressure systems that determined conditions along the Allied convoy routes between North America and Great Britain were generated in the Arctic and moved eastward with an anticipation of 2 to 4 days. Whoever controlled observation stations in the Svalbard archipelago, Franz Josef Land, or the northern coast of Greenland had an informational advantage over the enemy. Germany lost this advantage when Great Britain occupied Iceland in May of 1940, cutting the flow of meteorological data from the Western Atlantic toward German analysis centers. The response was the creation of a network of clandestine stations operated by teams of 15 to 25 men who transmitted encrypted data using the naval Enigma code. Between 1941 and 1945, the Kriegsmarine and the Meteorological Service of the Reich established at least 12 stations in remote Arctic territories. The Schatzgräber station, installed in September of 1943 on Alexandra Land in the Russian archipelago of Franz Josef Land, at 900 kilometers from the North Pole, was the most northern. It was operated under the command of the meteorologist Wilhelm Deige with a garrison of 21 men. Its equipment included standard meteorological instruments, but also a high-frequency communications system whose emission power, according to the inventory recovered by Norwegian explorers in 1951, was significantly superior to that necessary to transmit meteorological data. Dege was evacuated in August of 1944 after several members of the garrison suffered severe poisoning from consumption of polar bear meat in bad condition. He was the last German officer to formally surrender after the end of the war. He did so on September 4, 1945, 4 months after the German capitulation, to a Norwegian seal hunting boat, since no Allied military force had reached his position. The documents that Dege preserved and partially published in his memoirs of 1954 show that the station received, in addition to meteorological instructions, encrypted communications whose content was never fully revealed. The archives captured by the Allies indicate the existence of Arctic facilities with equipment inventories disproportionate for a purely meteorological function. The possibility that some of these bases served as support points for submarines or as encrypted communications relays for operations in North America has been neither definitively established nor ruled out. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, nicknamed the Tiger of Malaya for his conquest of Singapore in February of 1942, an operation in which 130,000 British soldiers surrendered before a numerically inferior Japanese force, commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines when General Douglas MacArthur began the reconquest of the archipelago in October of 1944. Since 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army had systematically looted the territories it occupied in Asia: China, Malaya, Indonesia, Burma, and the Philippines. The looting operated under the direct supervision of Prince Yasuhito Chichibu, brother of Emperor Hirohito, through an organization known internally as Kin no Yuri, the Golden Lily, although Western researchers denominate it principally as Yamashita's gold. The objective was to centralize the products of looting coming from central banks, museums, private collections, temples, and military reserves of all occupied Asia and transfer them to Japan to fund the continuation of the war. These transfers operated with relative normality until the United States Navy began to dominate the Pacific. From 1943 and with greater urgency in 1944, the solution adopted was to hide the material in territories still controlled by Japan, principally in the Philippine Islands, which counted on a network of natural caves and volcanic tunnels. The estimates of the value of the treasure vary enormously according to the source and the methodology. The journalists Sterling and Peggy Seagrave, in their 2003 study titled Gold Warriors, estimated that the volume of precious metals, jewels, and works of art transported to the Philippines could have reached a value equivalent to between $100 and $200 billion in current terms. This figure is difficult to verify in an independent manner, but it has a partial documentary base. Declassified records from the United States War Department and military intelligence indicate that in 1945, agents of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, located and accessed several of the deposits in the mountains of Luzon. What occurred with that material is what the Seagraves and other researchers describe as one of the most significant covert operations of the post-war period. According to this hypothesis, a significant portion of the recovered gold was used by the United States intelligence services to fund anti-communist operations in Asia during the Cold War, outside of any budgetary control of Congress. This fund would have been denominated the M Fund. Yamashita surrendered on September 2, 1945, the same day of the formal capitulation of Japan. He was tried by a military tribunal in Manila, convicted of war crimes, and executed on February 23, 1946. He revealed nothing about any treasure deposits. In 1971, a Filipino named Rogelio Roxas affirmed having found an underground chamber near Baguio that contained a solid gold Buddha and several metallic containers. He was arrested by authorities under President Ferdinand Marcos, who confiscated the materials and imprisoned him. Roxas subsequently sued the heirs of Marcos in the courts of Hawaii and obtained in 1996 a judgment of $40,500 million, reduced on appeal, which has never been collected. The judgment did not establish the existence of the complete treasure, but it did confirm the responsibility of Marcos for the theft of the materials that Roxas had found. The mountains of Luzon have been the subject of continuous illegal excavations since the 50s, with documented casualties from cave-ins and booby traps. What remains hidden in them, if anything remains, continues to be undetermined. The collapse of the Third Reich in the final months of 1945 was not solely the military defeat of a state. It was also the deliberate and systematic destruction of the archives that would have allowed historians to reconstruct with precision the decision-making within the regime. Himmler ordered the destruction of the SS archives in March of 1945. The records of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Central Security Office that coordinated the Gestapo, the SD, and the police forces, were burned in Berlin between April and May of that year. The documentation of the party chancellery was destroyed in Munich. The operational records of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that murdered more than 1.5 million people in the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1943, were destroyed so systematically that historians have had to reconstruct their operations principally from progress reports sent in duplicate, whose surviving duplicates were preserved in peripheral archives. This destruction process was not only bureaucratic, it was also personal. The leaders of the regime who died in the final days of the war or who were executed before they could be exhaustively interrogated took with them operational knowledge that no archive can recover. Martin Bormann, head of the party chancellery and the man who controlled access to Hitler in the final years of the regime, abandoned the Führerbunker on the night of May 1–2, 1945 in the group that was attempting to escape the Soviet siege of Berlin. His fate was the subject of speculation for decades. In 1972, skeletal remains found during construction works near the Lehrte station in Berlin were provisionally identified as those of Bormann. A DNA analysis carried out in 1998, comparing those remains with the DNA of a living nephew of Bormann, confirmed the identification with a high degree of probability. Bormann had died in Berlin in May of 1945, probably by a cyanide capsule to avoid capture. This confirmation, which arrived half a century after the facts, illustrates perfectly the type of uncertainty that characterized the first 50 years of research into the end of the Reich. But the question about the last secret that the Nazi leaders took to the grave does not refer so much to individuals as to the institutions and the knowledge they represented. The German program of weapons of mass destruction included not only the development of V-2 missiles in Peenemünde, but also research into chemical and biological weapons whose complete archives were never recovered. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biochemistry carried out experiments with biological agents during the war whose results, according to the partial archives available, went beyond what was publicly recognized in the Nuremberg trials. Operation Paperclip, through which United States intelligence services recruited more than 1,600 German scientists between 1945 and 1959, included individuals whose wartime files were expurgated to facilitate their integration into the United States scientific program. This systematic expurgation is in itself a perpetuated form of secrecy. What unites all the mysteries examined in this documentary is the same characteristic. The information that could resolve them did not disappear by accident. It disappeared because someone made the decision to destroy it, classify it, or simply not talk about it. The burned archives of the SS, the boxes with the fossils of the Peking man lost in the chaos of a port at war, the panels of the amber room that no one has been able to find, The last transmissions of the Gestapo in Lyon. The Second World War was the most documented conflict in history up to that moment, and yet its most important questions continue to depend on the blank spaces of that record. Decades after the German capitulation, archives continue to be declassified. Forensic analyses continue to be carried out. Researchers continue to find documents that reconfigure what we believed we knew. The history of the Second World War is not closed. It probably never will be entirely.